number of UN conferences of the parties in Europe, including the most recent one, COP24 in Poland. And it was really great. He was quoted in The Guardian yesterday commenting on the new recommendations from the West Australian Environmental Protection Authority, and it was a really, really useful contribution. So Richie is a very active member of the climate community, so to speak, and we're delighted to have him on board today. Richie, over to you.
Thanks, Rod, and thanks all for having me. Just let me know if the volume's not coming through. Just taking the call in the backyard because got two little kids asleep in the house. But it's a pleasure to be with you all today. So Rod mentioned that it would be useful for me to give a bit of a recap on what happened at COP24, as well as a steer on what's going on in Canberra right now in terms of climate policy around the federal election. And so probably start international and then we'll go national. But also just for those who don't know, the Australian Institute's Climate and Energy Program, to some extent, is a bit of a successor of the Climate Institute, which was a relatively well-known think tank that operated for about 10 years in Australia. And they packed up shop last year, or sorry, 2017 now, and then put up their IP and the rest of their work for tender. And that was won by the Australian Institute. They set up the program, and then I used it to jump ship from the government at just the right time and help take that work forward. So that's sort of the history of where this program's come from. It's relatively new, I guess, under the Australia Institute banner, but myself and many others at the Institute have been working on climate change for a long time, and myself in particular for the last 10 years, mainly on international climate negotiations. So the COP, the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, was held in the first 2 weeks of December last year in Katowice in Poland. It was a bit of an odd choice, but not a surprising one. This was the third time that Poland has hosted the COP in the last 10 years. The Poles tend to do this, we think, just because they make money from hosting COPs, not so much because they actually have any real interest in progressing climate change, which is why they had it in their sort of the heart of their coal country, which is what Katowice used to be. And there was actually like large coal mines and coal factories right around it. So it really was quite an odd place to host the meeting. And it I guess, symbolized where the climate negotiations were at. The whole purpose of the COP was basically to bed down the rules, the technical rules for how we will implement the Paris Agreement, which is the landmark agreement agreed 3 years ago then in 2015. But what was missing from 2015 to 2018 when the COP happened was, I guess, the big political players and the political momentum to see climate change really come to bear. So you had, obviously a change in government in the US, but then also a number of sort of other players, in particular, the Brazilian government has gone far to the right, and in fact, Brazil was supposed to host the COP this year, and just announced that it was going to pull out in December last year. So that also left things hanging. And when the US and sort of a number of others go a bit rogue, it creates space for the usual troublemakers to also try to scuttle or delay things. So you had Saudi Arabia sort of more active than usual. You had Russia more active than usual. And so usually Europe is the voice of reason, but then the Europeans themselves were also distracted. You had France dealing with the yellow vests and complaining about the impact of some of the climate policies there. You had the UK worried about Brexit. You had sort of Germany sort of in a big discussion with its unions and its coal miners around the future of coal. And so to some extent, most of the big players were quite distracted, and it created an absence of leadership. And so there's a real question mark as to where things would ultimately land, because a rule book was necessary sort of in order for everything to schedule and for the targets to be implemented in such a way where they'll be transparent and reviewable. When the time comes, then we needed to have some of the rules in place now. And then Australia, I guess was also disappointing because Australia was sort of leaning more towards the US and using US cover to also, I guess, play the role of a laggard. So there was a number of sort of things happening. At the same time, there were some unlikely heroes that sort of came out of the picture. some of which is sort of continuing that momentum. So you had the 15-year-old sort of Swedish teenager Greta, who is there sort of speaking on behalf of youth, and you've seen how that movement has just escalated, and I think we've got the big march next week. You had the UN Secretary General come on 3 different occasions just in that 1-2 week period, and you had sort of a number of celebrities pop in as well. So it's almost like as if in the absence of political leadership, you had sort of more of a public broad interest, and I think that really helped push things across the line, as well as obviously the smaller countries. There's a coalition of high ambition and with a number of Pacific Island countries and smaller European countries. And so the dynamics are really quite interesting to see. Where Australia ended up in that space is it was Minister Price's first trip overseas. And so it was a real question as to what she would do, and the answer was she did very little. She tried to do as little as possible. She did no media. She held no events. She basically did the bare minimum, which is a standalone speech on behalf of Australia to the general plenary, as well as hosting a stakeholder event. And Australia, played a relatively constructive role at the technical level, but at a political level, it was either nowhere to be found, or if you dug a little deeper, supporting fossil fuel interests. And we saw that manifest when the ambassador for the environment, Patrick Suckling, who was a DFAT career public servant, but from my personal experience sort of leans more to where the government's disposition is on climate change, decided to take the stage alongside US appointees or Trump appointees in order to support the continuing use of fossil fuels in any climate solution. So it was sort of disappointing that was the only time that Australia was seen, and that was the only time Australia got international media coverage. But that's sort of the politics and the color of how it all played out. In the end, a rule book was agreed. It is relatively good for where things were at, with all things considered. It beds down some of the rules around transparency, and it makes sure that there is no difference between how developing countries report and how developed countries report, which is a major difference in the previous iteration under the Kyoto Protocol. It puts sort of science firmly within the scope of how we determine what is ambitious, what is not ambitious, and it also creates the right framework, I guess, for monitoring and evaluating and upgrading and taking stock take and putting a number of other things in place. It fell a bit short in terms of determining how the market mechanism, the international market mechanism, will work under the UNFCCC. But what's clear is that the previous market mechanism, which was the Clean Development Mechanism, will not continue. That most parties are interested in coming up with a fresh market mechanism. In a sense, I guess the CDM is tainted with a lot of the hot air that it ended up churning and a few other sort of things. And so, because that was quite contentious, a lot of those rules didn't bed down. But most parties are telling me now that will likely conclude towards the COP at the end of this year. So the rule book itself was quite a good outcome, and I guess the symbolism that you don't need the big political players to get a good, to continue to progress climate action internationally was also a good outcome. The next element on the international schedule is in September. The UN Secretary General will host a climate summit for world leaders, and his goal is to increase ambition. So to increase ambition on climate targets, but also increase ambition on climate finance. So sort of the aid that developed countries and growing amount developing countries provide to incentivize and assist with climate action, both mitigation and adaptation. That's interesting, and the reason I mention that is because if we do have a change in government in May, and by all accounts the election will be on the 18th of May, then that will be the first occasion that Bill Shorten will take the global stage on climate change. And so there's a real opportunity, I guess, to push him to be as ambitious as possible and to push the Labour Party as a future government to be as ambitious as possible. The 45% target that they have, which is to reduce emissions 45% below the 2005 level by 2030, is at the very bottom of what would be considered a fair target for Australia to take on. And so there's scope for him to increase that target. In addition, and this is probably jumping into some of the national issues that we're dealing with now, there is an issue around whether Australia will use its Kyoto carryover credits. So I'm not sure to what extent you guys are familiar with this. It's really kind of come up in the media thanks to a lot of good work from Peter Hannam in the Herald. But under the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first climate agreement, in the sense the predecessor to the Paris Agreement, Australia had two targets. So from 2008 to 2012, it was supposed to limit its emissions to 108% above 1990 levels. And then in the second period, which is 2013 to 2020, Australia was supposed to reduce its emissions to 99.5% of 1990 levels. So not very ambitious targets under either of those periods. So not very hard for Australia to achieve. And to make things even easier for Australia, when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated in 97, the Howard government and Robert Hill, who was the environment minister at the time, basically held up the negotiations in order to get through a clause, which is commonly called the Australia Clause, which basically allows countries, but specifically Australia as the main beneficiary of this, to account for land sector emissions in how its baseline was set. And because it was a massive reduction in land sector emissions from 1990 to 97, then that basically created an inflated baseline for Australia from which it could then increase its emissions, in the first period, and then just basically, nominally reduce it to 99.5, but again, from an inflated base. So really, Australia hasn't had to reduce its emissions in either of the two periods. And it generated over 360 million tons of credits out of that entire period, which this government has now said it will use to meet its Paris Agreement target. And that will mean that it will cut Australia's target in half, in a sense. So Australia has to reduce almost close to 700 million tons between 2021 and 2030. So if we can use the 360 million tons of credits, then it basically reduces it by half. So it has a major impact if Australia is supposed to do this. The reason I mention it is because it's really quite dodgy, like not just for all those reasons, but also because if Australia was serious about meeting its Paris target, then it would recognize that the whole purpose of the agreement was to reduce your emissions going forward. It wasn't to take advantage of dodgy credits that you accrued in the past. And so almost every other developed country has ruled this out and specifically said this is not in the spirit of the Paris Agreement. New Zealand did it at the COP, in COP24, so a couple of months ago. The UK, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, they all ruled it out. And so what we're very keen to do is to pressure this government and also the Labour Party to do the same thing. Because the Labour Party will be under even more pressure to do it, because if they have to meet a 45% target, then they'll want all the help they can get, because emissions are going up. They have been going up for 5 years, and they're going to continue to go up. So they'll be looking for all the help they can get. This seems like a get out of jail free card, and so we really want to make sure that card is not on the table. So that's a major focus of ours, and we're doing a bit of work around that. We're looking at sort of what the legal sort of options are. We're looking at some of the numbers. We're talking to whoever we can. In Perth, Bill Hare over at Climate Analytics has done a bit of work around this. So we're talking to Bill a fair bit. And then some academics over at Melbourne Uni are also working on this too. So that's a major focus. And that's probably a good segue to jump into some of the national stuff, if that's good, Rod. And do you want me to just keep going? Yeah? Oh, all right. So as much as we'd be very keen to work on sort of prospective ideas for what climate change policy should be, it was almost like as if we spend most of our time putting out fires. This Kyoto Protocol issue is just one example. The other one is the fact that the government still has a program to underwrite new generation, which is really just an opportunity for Angus Taylor to give money to some of his mates to set up new coal-fired power stations or gas-fired power stations. This program has been rushed. There are no formal guidelines to this program. They've already requested registrations of interest. They got 66 registrations, 10 of which are for new or refurbed coal. And there's no clarity around how they're going to judge this. There's no budget for the program, and so we've been attacking this program every which way we can, because we just think it would be terrible for this government to lock in a new coal-fired power station using taxpayer funds, which will ensure that we have emissions for another 50 years. And so we commissioned legal advice from a barrister down in Melbourne, who basically recommended or advised us that this program doesn't have any legislative mandate, which means to some extent it's unconstitutional until they pass legislation in support of it. And we know that they're not working on any legislation right now. So that's sort of one chink. We're also looking at in terms of cost. We know that it's going to be part of the budget negotiations. Budget's coming up I think in the first week of April. So we're doing a paper now, building on some great work that CSIRO and AEMO, the energy market operator, did in December, where it looked at the price of new renewables, the cost of new renewables as a generation source versus new coal versus new gas. And then it looked at it with renewables having 2 hours of storage behind it, and 6 hours of storage. And it also looked at coal and gas with a 5% liability, assuming that there'll be some sort of impost on greenhouse gases. And it found that under any scenario, new renewables come out as a more affordable energy source. So we're doing some work around that to really show that that's probably the most affordable way we can go. And then we're looking at it in terms of in terms of government process that could be challenged, and sort of a few other ways. So we're really trying to deal with this program lest it leave us in a terrible position, as well as some of the other programs that the government suggested. And so last week was just a big announcement week for the government to try and demonstrate that it is willing to do something on climate change. It's typical of a coalition government, facing the door out to suddenly fund climate change and announce emissions trading schemes or whatever. But we're looking at the Emissions Reduction Fund, which is now being called the Climate Solutions Fund. So Morrison wants to put in an additional $2 billion over 10 years, which is actually less money over a longer period of time compared to the $2.5 billion that was put in over the last 5 years. We're looking at how, if you are going to keep the ERF, how you could potentially improve the integrity of the system, but ultimately what you could probably do with the rest of the money and we know that Labor is not in support of continuing the ERF, so we're looking at that. We're looking at the safeguards mechanism, which is, I guess, the other part to the Emissions Reduction Fund, and how you could turn that into a basic planning credit scheme. And then is everyone still there? I'm just seeing a giant phone on my screen, but I'm assuming that, yeah, okay. And then we're looking at, I guess, some of these announcements around hydro. We have an office, the Australian Institute has an office down in Tasmania, so we're looking at some of the stuff around the new Tasmanian link for the national energy market, as well as some of the hydro TAS projects, as well as Snowy Hydro. So we're kind of going through it step by step to evaluate whether this is actually decent government policy or whether this is all just band-aids in order to not look so like such recalcitrance. And then we're also continuing our work around stressing that Australia has a responsibility to reduce its emissions by also limiting exports of coal and gas. And so that's another big part of what we're doing. We've been quite active in WA and in the Northern Territory around ensuring that the moratoriums on fracking were not opened up, and we've done a fair bit of work in terms of assessing how limited the jobs impact would be if you move to no new coal and no new gas in both those locations, what the economic impact would be, and so forth. And so that's why we were responding yesterday and the day before to the West Australian Environmental Protection Agency's guidelines around how these LNG projects going forward and some of the existing ones should offset their emissions, their direct net emissions, which we think is a great outcome. Really, it's what the safeguards mechanism should be doing, but it's not. And so it's great to see a government agency actually willing to take that kind of leadership and willing to take that kind of flack. to do that. So we're looking at how we can best support that and make sure that that doesn't get pushed away. And then we're sort of doing some other stuff. Around, we have kind of an ongoing battle with the Business Council of Australia, because the Business Council of Australia said that a 45% emission reduction target is economy wrecking, and they put this out randomly in a tweet, and then instead of retracting it when it was challenged, they doubled down. And so we've just been sort of spending the last 6 months just demonstrating how it's not economy wrecking, how every government analysis and modeling has shown that it doesn't have a substantial impact on the economy, and really just demonstrating the Business Council of Australia is just talking out of its ass. And I think just 2 days ago, Mark Butler wrote to the Business Council of Australia telling them to retract that statement. So I think the Business Council of Australia is in a very awkward position now, where it could be on the wrong side of an incoming government and really limit its ability to influence, which we're quite happy with. So those are some of the things that we're up to. We've probably got a few more things in transport, in agriculture, and a few other sectors, but that's the lion's share. Oh, and also there's the Senate inquiry into fair dinkum power. I'm not sure if you guys are aware that Sarah Hanson-Young is heading up, and we did a big submission to that particular inquiry. It's all about empowering consumers to find different ways to reduce their emissions. We've got a rule change in with the Australian Energy Market Commission, the AEMC, in order to create a rule that allows consumers to use demand response. So to actually participate in the market in terms of choosing when they want to dial down their energy, or to sell in their energy, much like a market player, and basically to do this without the help of the major energy company retailers, who don't want this to go through, because it will empower consumers to basically to basically make money on the market, reduce their energy use, reduce their emissions, and it just challenges their power source. So we're pushing this rule change, and also we're speaking to the Senate committee, I think next week or the week after, about this rule. So that's sort of what's going on now. Or maybe just a quick bit in terms of how the election's looking, I guess. But I don't know, it sounds like you guys are pretty well tapped into the parliament with this great friends group that you set up. So, but I'm happy to go there if interest.
Well, thank you, Richie. We'll leave you a bit there for the moment, and we'll have a few questions coming up. But first of all, congratulations for having such a wide coverage over all the important issues, and it's great to have you there leading the charge for us. And it's obviously very important that we meet with you very soon to consider some ways in which we can work together, and particularly figure out how we can inject carbon pricing into the conversation a bit more effectively. And so I'd like to just start with one question, and one is that, as you know, we're very keen on a company-wide carbon price, which we know Labor is not particularly interested in. But I'm interested to know your thoughts about by introducing a carbon price, what chances do we have of bringing the climate movement with us once we get a bit of momentum? Because it's clear that industry is now calling for it, and that gives us some leverage. And what are your thoughts about bringing the climate movement along with us?
Yeah, I was thinking about this one, Rod. It's so unfortunate that carbon pricing is no longer considered. It has all this baggage, I guess, in Canberra. I started out at the Department of Climate Change back when we had one, working on the carbon pollution reduction scheme and building the auction system, and then it's in all the graphs that we do when we monitor emissions, we always show where the carbon price operated and how, so it's just effective, it's simple, and to some extent it just shows how disingenuous businesses are complaining about uncertainty when they had it and they scuttled it basically by just jumping ship like rats. Unfortunately, it's a tough sell. Like I was talking to some friends in the Greens about, who still have carbon price as one of the policies they want to put forward, but just don't actively spruik it like they used to. And it's still a hard sell, and there's no legitimate reason for it, because economically it makes sense. It's proven, it works overseas. But it's just still a hard sell, and it's almost like no one is really pushing it within the Canberra bubble, if you want to call it that. The only way where I think it could really come up is if new players start to introduce it, if that makes sense. The new players, I would think, because to some extent the Greens, Labor just does not listen to the Greens. Labor still believes that the Greens wrecked the CPRS because they didn't jump on board in 2009. Like, you talk to anyone who's around in Labor, and that's the first thing they'll say, and then they won't want to talk about it anymore. Like it's like an open wound that hasn't healed. So it's very difficult to try and bridge those two parties. But almost like as if the new players might be able to suggest it. And the new players, I'm talking about the independents. And it's great that you got Sharky. And then to some extent, if new independents do come on the scene post-May, some of which might hold the balance of power, I think that would be really interesting. Like Sally Stagel, like Oliver Yates, So that would be one way. The other way would be is if you could get some of the youth, basically those who are marching on climate on the 15th, to actually start putting that forward, because right now there's a lot of momentum just without the policy. And to some extent you guys have the policy, so it could be quite a neat marriage. I know they're sort of reaching about. I know there's some very capable climate campaigners who used to be involved with 350 and now have a new organization called Tipping Point, that are quite heavily behind it, as well as the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. So that could be a new way. It's almost like as if you need new faces with political momentum, or power, balance of power, to really re-inject this as a legitimate idea. And I like the idea of a dividend, because it's not just a tax. You can't just write it off as a tax, I guess, is what the real concern would be for many Labor Party people. It's a way of redistributing wealth, and redistribution is becoming a more common approach. We've been very active in the tax debate as well. So climate and energy is just one part, and that's what I focus on entirely. But we were very active in the corporate tax discussion last year, to the point where we were right amongst it when the corporate tax cuts were abandoned, right when Turnbull was out the door. And it's the first time, I think, that a tax cut hasn't been approved in Australian sort of history, parliamentary history. So the entire concept of what we do with our revenue and the services that we want and the distribution of wealth that we have, I think is starting to evolve. And so there could be fertile ground, but you probably might need some fresh political players to help push that along.
Thanks for that tip. I think we can see some ways forward there. So thanks very much for that, Richie. We're out of time for other questions, but what I'd like to do is thank you very much and point out that this has been recorded, and quite a few of our groups who can't meet on a Saturday will be watching the recording and then thinking about local actions accordingly. So, but also, you've said a lot of really useful stuff there. So for us to unpack that, we'll have to listen to it again, and I'll certainly be doing that shortly to gain as much benefit from what I've heard from you. But also, very importantly, we'll do everything we can to arrange a meeting with you soon.
Sure. Very, very happy to. Our office is just down the road from Parliament House, so next time you're here, more than welcome to come.
Thank you very much, Richie. I look forward to that.